November, the Murdaugh murders was the subject of an episode of Dateline. And before the episode even ran, when just the promos were airing, our group chat at Luna Shark was on fire. Why? Because in the teaser, we saw that Dateline had gotten recordings of SLED's interviews with Randy, John Marvin, and Buster Murdaugh, which had never been aired before. We didn't know they existed, nor did we think that they would be available for FOIA. So naturally, our reporter Beth Braden got right on that and FOIA'd for them. In the meantime, Dateline actually ended up running very little of that footage. Right before the new year, our FOIA came in, and just as we suspected, there was a lot more to this story.
Another thing we learned in these videos is just how privileged and chaotic Paul and Buster's lives were. They traveled across the state extensively, following college sports and hanging out with friends, staying in the upstate, staying at the beach, staying at Moselle, staying at the apartments that each young man maintained in Columbia. They also each had at least 2 vehicles that they considered theirs. And they didn't really work. There was one point when the SLED agent asked Buster about his job at Wild Wing, and Buster was like, I don't know, I made calls, and then I had to go to Party City, and then this happened. Meaning he'd only worked 1 day before the murders. The SLED agent was like, oh, did you work before that? And Buster, who had graduated college 3 years earlier with no awareness, was like, no. During the interviews, we also got a closer look at just how present 14th Circuit Solicitor Duffy Stone's team was in the investigation. Remember, Duffy is a prosecutor. His investigators are supposed to be prepping cases for prosecution, not to be conducting boots-on-the-ground investigations into murders. This is the only case where it seems that Duffy and his entire investigation team were on the scene for multiple days. So, one of the biggest bombshells to come out of these interview tapes is something that has been whispered about for a long time. How did John Marvin get to Moselle?
So Monday morning, it gets a little bit. So my brother Randy calls me. My dad has a doctor's appointment in Savannah, and long story, he's been battling all kinds of issues, cancers, and just got out of the hospital on Sunday. But he has an appointment, a follow-up appointment Monday, and it turns out it's earlier than we anticipated, and I was scheduled to drive him that afternoon. Randy calls me and says, meet me in Ridgeland. I'm going to have Daddy. We'll go swap cars, and you take him on to Savannah. Okay. And so we did that. We met at Palmetto Co-op in Ridgeland, and I drove him to Savannah. Doctor's appointment. Well, the doctor checks him out and says, man, we got to get you in the hospital. So we spent all afternoon getting him checked into the hospital. As the evening, later in the evening, I probably left Savannah probably 5-ish. Okay. In my mom's car, because my brother had given me my mom's car with my dad. My brother took my truck back to my parents' house right here in Alameda. So I leave there. I call Paul, and I said, man, you going back to Hampton tonight? He said, yes. So I said, if you can wait, take my mom's car to Alameda, drop it off, get my truck, bring my truck in the morning, and then, I'll drive your truck to work, and we'll, be back in our own vehicles.
Okay. And did that happen?
Yes. Well,
so what?
Yeah, all that transpired until not swapping cars back the following morning, of course.
Okay,
so he took my mom's car, dropped it at Alameda. Yep. Alameda where my parents live.
Okay. By the way. Yep.
Got my truck, drove it to presumably drove it to Moselle.
Okay.
And
so your truck was at Moselle?
My truck was at Moselle, and his truck is at my house. When I got the call that night from Ellic, of course, the only car that I don't have my truck, so I get in Paul's truck and start driving it back to meet Ellic.
So this is the very first time we're hearing that Paul went to Alameda before he went to Moselle the night he was killed. There is nothing in SLED's timeline to suggest that Paul did this, though, meaning there's nothing in the records that shows Paul picking up John Marvin's truck at Alameda that night, but the truck was at Moselle. And there was also no indication that Miss Libby's car was at Moselle, as far as we could tell. During the trial, John Marvin was asked to explain how Paul's truck ended up on the side of the road. Now, this was his beater truck. It was a 2008 Ford F-250 diesel that he used when his regular truck was in the shop, which his was at the time of the murders.
Did the farm truck break down?
It did.
How'd you end up getting to Moselle?
Well, so let me back up and tell you. So So the route that from my house down in Okatee, Beaufort, takes me to Coosawhatchee, and I get on 95 to go to Yemassee and getting off and coming up that way. Well, another close family friend, his name is Greg Alexander. He is the chief of police in Yemassee. I reach out to him and I just say, Greg, I gave him said something bad had happened. Or again, I don't know when I was told about the sheets, but I told him, I said, listen, something bad's happened. We got to get up there. When I get to Yemassee, can you please help make sure I get to Moselle? Because this truck's sputtering and I knew it wasn't good. And he met me at Yemassee, and he fell in behind me, and we started driving until he finally passed me in Varnville.
Now let's hear from David, who is going to read to you from one of the incident reports in the murders investigation. This is a supplemental narrative from a Colleton County Sheriff's Office deputy named William Polk.
On June 8, 2021, I, Lieutenant Polk, along with Lieutenant Crosby, located one of the victim's vehicles, Paul Murdaugh, 2008 Ford F-250, white over tan, bearing license plate IZF-269, in front of 4736 Highway 63, Hampton County, unoccupied. The vehicle was facing in the direction toward Walterboro, South Carolina.
So let's talk about why getting this straight was important. But first, I want to note that John Marvin Murdaugh has not been charged with anything, and there have been no formal accusations made about his actions on the night of the murders. But there have been questions since the very beginning. In fact, both Randy and Buster were asked about the truck John Marvin was driving that night. Why? Well, the whole thing's very confusing. Again, there's no evidence of Paul going to Alameda that night, and yet John Marvin's truck was at Moselle. This is not something that was brought up at trial, by the way. At no point did the prosecution point out that there was any discrepancies here. We're just saying we don't see where in the testimony or in the documents we've received from our FOIA, which included the full timeline of events for the evening, which plotted out every move Paul seemed to make that night, it says that Paul went to Alameda. Another reason there have been questions could be because there are 3 suggested routes to Moselle from John Marvin's house in Okatee. John Marvin didn't take any of them. Instead, he opted for a route that did not significantly lengthen his trip, but it did take him past Alameda. We know where Paul's truck was found broken down, and that's between Alameda, where Ellic's parents lived, and Moselle. And it was pointing toward Walterboro, which means it was traveling northeast. To get to Moselle, John Marvin would have taken a left off of that highway had he not broken down. Now, John Marvin lives southeast of Moselle and would have been traveling northwest to get there, meaning the fastest, most direct route does not pass by Alameda, and in fact, he has to travel more westward to get there. So why did John Marvin take the Alameda route? That's the big question.
Now, one of the most interesting things is how John Marvin accidentally told on Ellic. Here is what he had to say about the clothes Ellic was wearing that night. He thought he was being helpful to his brother, but no.
Well, do you remember what Alec was wearing that night?
Yeah, I do, actually.
Yeah.
I do. He was wearing a T-shirt.
Okay.
It was a T-shirt I was amazed that he still had them, and I was amazed that it fit him. Well, actually, I don't know that it fit him because I think I saw his belly. Mm-hmm. But it was a T-shirt that said Black Sheep on it. It was the name of my sport fish boat that I had.
Okay. And
I remember seeing it and thinking I hadn't seen those shirts in a long time.
So it's an old shirt?
Yeah, it's an old T-shirt.
When did y'all make these T-shirts?
I mean, shoot, man, it would have been 2009, 10, okay. 11, somewhere in there.
So 10 years ago or so.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. What color was the T-shirt?
It's a white T-shirt.
Okay. So you had that on, and then
I think he had shorts on.
Okay.
Those of you who watched every second of the trial will remember that Blanca testified that there was a pile of folded white T-shirts where it looked like someone had pulled a shirt from the bottom of the pile, which was odd to her. Could it have been because Ellic was looking for an undershirt that he wouldn't miss? Investigators do believe that the shirt Ellic was wearing that night was the one he had been wearing under the bluish button-up fishing shirt he was wearing in the Snapchat tree video that Paul had taken shortly before the murders. Now, something that really shocked us, but also not really, while watching these videos, John Marvin was the first person we have seen to bring up the Smith family and potentially point the direction of the Murdaugh murders investigation toward them. Remember, at this point, there wasn't a single article that mentioned that the Murdaugh name was all over the Stephen Smith file, and no one had written about Stephen Smith at all since 2015. After the boat crash, though, people on social media started talking and posting memes that said justice for Mallory, justice for Stephen. A certain subset of listeners out there want to say that the Murdaugh family name was only associated because of a story I wrote shortly after the murders in 2021. But look here at John Marvin bringing it up himself before that story was published. Oddly enough, my story was published later that night, and I swear none of my sources told me about these interviews at that time.
Have you got any questions for us?
Well, not so much questions, but one of your agents, the female that I walked the house with at Moselle, what's her name?
Red hair?
Yes.
Agent McAllister.
McAllister.
Yep.
Katie McAllister.
Yep.
So, and I asked her then, I said, listen, I said, when something like this, when this happened, I've kind of gotten a little bit of tidbits of information. I had a guy call me, and I wanted to tell her about it, and I thought she was going to call me back. And anyway, I had a guy call me. His name is Lawrence Murdaugh. We're not related.
Okay.
And he said he read somewhere where if there was anything suspicious to the general public, please let us know or let somebody know.
Absolutely.
Okay. He called me and said that he saw a black SUV off of. He lived, and I don't know what road it is, but he described it as when you're leaving Hampton, you turn left at Crocketville, I believe he said. And there was some reference over the past after a year or so about a hit and run that supposedly they tried to say that Paul had something to do with.
Okay.
Or Buster had something to do with. Lawrence Murdaugh said he saw a black SUV sitting there at the site, where I assume there's some type of a marker there. Mm-hmm. And he said, John, I don't know whether it means anything or not, but it stood out to me, and I wanted to let you know.
Okay.
And so that's, you may could get more information from him about it, but that's what he told me.
Now, as we said before, we are getting back into the Stephen Smith case soon, and we are still asking the public to submit tips to answersforstephen.com to help us with our investigation. But it's really interesting to note that John Marvin brought this up on his own account. Not sure who Lawrence Murdaugh is, but we are interested in trying to figure out what they were actually saying here. SLED did follow through with this direction. Remember, a few days later, I wrote a story about how upset Sandy Smith was that SLED called her, and she thought that they were reopening Stephen's investigation. But really, they were just wanting her and her family to come in for questioning in the double homicide. Well, something happened between June 10th and June 20th when SLED reopened the Stephen Smith investigation. Sandy was never questioned for the double homicide. Instead, they told her that they were investigating Stephen's death because of something they found during the course of the double homicide. We have a lot more to uncover when it comes to the Stephen Smith case, and again, we are excited to start a new investigation. Please, if you know anything about Stephen's death, send us a tip at answersforstephen.com. And of course, please contact law enforcement at tips@sled.se.gov for a $30,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and a conviction. We want 2024 to be Stephen's year, and hopefully the year that Ellic Murdaugh stops clogging up the state's resources and authorities finally start holding Ellic Murdaugh's accomplices accountable. Stay tuned, stay pesky, stay in the sunlight.